Hello. Many people have been asking questions about floats, and it's true. Floats are a little bit difficult to understand. They don't act the way that we imagine they might. So I'm making this video to show you a little bit more clearly, I hope, what floats are, how they work, and why we want to use them. So let's begin with this example. We have two divs here. The green div at the top has no text in it. The red div at the bottom has some text. Both of them are not floated. So these are block elements, therefore each one has its own separate line. There are breaks above and below. This is how things normally look. But if you introduce a float, by making the green box at top floating, well, the no float container, the red div with no float, it slides underneath the green div. But the text which is in the red div, that stays outside of the float. It wraps around the floated object. So we have this red div with text. The two parts, the div and the text, act differently. The div goes under the float, the text stays outside of the float. Now, why is this? Well, let's say we have this situation. We have an image and we want text to flow around it. This is what we want to see on a page. So how does that happen? Well, let's imagine you have those two things. You have a block object. Let's say it's an image inside of a figure tag. That's the green box at the top. Below, you have a div, or perhaps another block element like a paragraph, and that has a lot of text in it. Right now, neither one is floated, and so they're just on different lines. Now, if you float the green box and the div with text just goes around it to the right, well, then this is what would happen. But it doesn't happen because we don't want this. We want the text to go not only around the float to the side, we want it to go underneath the floated box as well. But since the div or paragraphs, these can only be simple rectangles, they cannot become some sort of backwards L shape. So in order to get around this, what happens instead is this. The div, the red div with the text, the div itself goes underneath the float, but the text wraps around the float. So this is what happens when you use a floated object like an image in a figure tag, and then you float that, and then you have text around it. So let me try to demonstrate what this looks like in a real web page. So here's a web page that I've prepared, and I've styled it so that it will hopefully make this a little bit more clear. We have an image, and I made the image slightly transparent so you can see through it. If something goes behind it, we'll be able to see it. Here we have some text above and below, and these are in paragraph tags or P tags. And so you can see right now, everything is on a separate line because the P tags are blocks above and below, so the image is on its own line. But what if we float the image? Well, let's see what happens. I'm going to go up to where the image is. So the image is right here. It's Ponta. You can see that I've added a class called wrap. And so when I go up to style the wrap, I'm going to change the float to left. So that's all I'm doing. So I'm just taking this image and I'm making it float left. So I'm going to save it and I'm going to reload it, and this is what happens. Now you can see that the text is wrapping around it, but look at those red boxes. Look at the paragraphs. The paragraphs actually extend all the way to the left. The paragraph tags, which are blocks, these slide underneath the picture of Ponta. But the text in those red paragraph boxes, that does not go underneath the picture of Ponta. It stays out here to the right. Now, normally we can't see this because normally we don't have a solid red border around paragraphs, and normally the picture is not transparent. So if I make those changes, this is what it looks like. So this is what it looks like when you float an image and the text wraps around it. It looks like the paragraphs are just sitting to the right of the image. But in fact, the paragraph block elements are actually sliding underneath the image to the left. That's why we have this paragraph right here. Notice that when I select the text is in kind of a backwards L shape. We've got these two lines of the paragraph to the right of the photograph and these two lines down here underneath the photograph. But that's an impossible shape for a block element like a paragraph tag. So in fact, the paragraph tag is a regular rectangle which is underneath the picture right here. And because it slides underneath the picture, it can remain a rectangle while the text wraps around the image and takes on the shape that you want. Now, many people are having problems with clears as well. So let me see if I can explain how this might work. Now, you might notice that down here I have an HR, or a horizontal rule. So I'm going to go into the code. I'm going to find that horizontal rule, and I'm going to put it up about right here. I'm going to put it after the first paragraph, which is right next to the image. So I'm going to save that. And so now we have this HR right here. So I would like this horizontal rule to go down over here, and I'd like this space underneath the rule to be clear. So let's see how we can do that. One way of doing it is to add a clear to the horizontal rule. I'm going to say clear and both. I could just say clear left because the image is on the left, but I'm saying clear both for right now. And so when I do that, this horizontal rule has a clear, and therefore it must now go to the bottom of the float. And that's exactly what happens. So now this space is clear. But let's say I want this horizontal rule to stay up here, and I just want the paragraph to go there. Well, there's a way to do that as well. I'm going to go back. I'm going to get rid of the clear on the HR, and instead I'm going to add a style to the very next paragraph. I'm going to say style and clear and both. And there we go. All right, so hopefully now we'll see the horizontal line here, but the paragraph will stay down there. And that's exactly what happened. So these are two ways to clear this floated image. That's what clears are for. It's to get you down below the floats so that the floats are no longer causing problems. So let's take a look at another problem with floats. One thing that you should know is that an empty block element has no height. If you add text or other content, they gain height. So blocks will get bigger, or I should say taller, the more you add content to them. Floated elements, however, even ones with height, do not add height to a block container. In order to make the container big enough to hold the floated elements, you must add a cleared element below them. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So here we have a situation where there is a green div with a float on the left, and there is an orange div on the right, also with a float. So those two are floated. The green div is floating left, the orange div is either floating left or right. But notice that below them we've got some text. And that text is what's causing the blue box to expand downwards. If you add more text, then the blue div, the container, is going to increase in size so that it will surround all of that content. The more text you add, the bigger the blue box will become. That's how block elements work. They increase if you put more content in them. They increase in size. All right, well, what if you take away all of that text? Now we only have two divs, and both divs are floating. Well, what happens is this. The blue container just seems to disappear. It actually goes all the way up to the top. Why? Because the blue container now has nothing to give it any height. Yes, there are two divs inside of it. The green div and the orange div are inside of the blue div, but they're floating. So they don't contribute any height. So that blue div just seems to disappear. Only the border remains at the top. In order to make that blue div come back down and surround the floating divs, you've got to add a cleared element below the divs. Then that blue div will come around and surround everything. And that's the way that you want it to appear. So let me see if I can show you what this is like in a real web page. So I've created a page here that has a green div and a blue div, and those are both inside of that big red div. So if we want to take a look at the code, this is what it looks like. We have the first div, the red one, that's titled ID1, and that's surrounding these other two divs, the number 2 div and the number 3 div. So the number 2 div is the green one, the number 3 one is the blue one. So none of these are floated yet. And the green and the blue divs are inside the red div. So that's what it looks like. Now let's see what happens if we make this green div into a floating div. So I'm going to go up to number 2, because that's the one that's green, and I'm going to add a float left. So there we go. I'm going to save it. And so now, because this is floating on the left, the blue div will come up and slide down behind it, although the text will not do that. The text will go out to the side. Let's reload. And there we go. As predicted, you can see that the blue div slid underneath the green div, and the text in the blue div went off, wrapping around the float. But notice what happened to the green div here. The green div is sticking out below not only the red div, but the whole wrapper. So why is that happening? Well, you'll notice that the red div decreased in height, but it's still surrounding this blue div right here. Why is that? Because the blue div has no float. So it's still giving height to the red div. But the green div is now floating, therefore it is not giving any height to the red div. In fact, it's sticking out. Now, if I take the blue div, number 3, and if I float that one also, let's say float, and this time I'm going to float it to the right. So here's the green div, it's floating to the left. The blue div will be floating to the right. I save that, and now I'm going to reload. So now you can see the blue div is floating on the right, the green div is floating on the left, but look what's happened to the container. This red div is holding both of these divs right here, but it's disappeared to almost nothing. Well, that's because there's almost nothing that's giving it height. As a matter of fact, the only reason it has any height at all is because the red div has padding inside of it. If I take away the padding, if I say there's only 0 pixels of padding, all that we're going to see is the border right up there. So how do we have the 2 divs floating inside of the red div, but make the red div surround them and make it so that the end of the wrapper doesn't come up so high? How do we do that? Well, first of all, let me give the padding back to the red div. So now we've got padding there. But still, we need to make the red div come all the way down here, and then we want to have the whole wrapper come down around them as well. Well, the way that you do that is you have to go after the last div in the red one. So remember, this is the red div, this is the green, this is the blue. So after the last blue div, we're going to add a cleared element. This is what I called the magic tag. It's just a simple break. And I'm going to say break and style, and I'm going to say clear and both. And so now we have, at the bottom of the red div, we have a cleared element. And so what that's going to do is that it's going to pull that red div down, and it's going to pull the wrapper down with it. And so now we have the effect that we want. So if you have floated objects, floated elements like divs, you have to remember they do not give any height to a block element that they are inside. So you have to clear something below them in order to give that element some height. Okay, so I hope that this answers some of your questions about floats and clears. And if you have any questions, of course, you can just ask me by email or in or after class, or make an appointment to see me. Not as many people as should be are making appointments. Please make an appointment to see me or see the tutors in the Learning Center. Thank you very much.